wonderful worship. We are grateful that you have been able to sing for us. Tata Msumba must be very lucky to have you, because at least you have a choir. And for those who don't know Tata Msumba, Tata Sembilo, he's a good pianist. So Mama Tama is good at singing, and then Tata Sembilo is good at playing the keyboard and the piano. Thank you. Friends, today we are privileged to be talking about something very important, something very fundamental to the Christian faith, and that is education. When I talked about education the last time I talked, I told you that when you read the Great Commission, as outlined in Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 to 20, you see that in verse 19 they say, and teaching them to obey. And so what is incumbent on us when we read the Great Commission is that Christianity is inherently a teaching job. Christian formation and Christian ministry, within that there is an interesting link between education, teaching, and how Christians are discipled and they become able to do good things. When you look at the great revivals, if you look at the Renaissance, when you look at whatever has happened in the history of Christianity, education has gone hand in hand with how revivals and how Christian movements have been held. And to help us understand Christianity, we have with us Mrs. Petrina Kawoya. Mrs. Petrina Kawoya is one of us. She works with us in the children's ministry on the Online Church of Uganda. She's been interested in children's education and ministry for a very long time. She's one of the proprietors of the peak schools that are based in Ntinda. But above all, she loves the Lord. She loves teaching. She loves forming students and children. And she's a great lady. Mrs. Petrina Kawoya, you are most welcome to this panel discussion. And I would ask you to just open the video so that you can be able to come on the screen. And together with with Mrs. Kawoya is our elder on the Online Church of Uganda, and that is the Reverend Canon Dr. John Senyonyi. This one also needs no introduction because he's been a part of the education space for a very, very long time. He started off his journey as a teaching assistant at Makerere University in the Department of Mathematics. So he's a mathematician. And then the evangelistic blood got the better of him, and he went into AEE, and it is from there that he was fished to come to Uganda Christian University, first as a chaplain, then as a deputy vice chancellor in charge of finance and administration, and then as a deputy vice chancellor in charge of development and external relations, eventually rising to the level of vice chancellor, a position he held for 10 years. Right now, I don't know whether to say he's in retirement because he's busier than he was when he was still at UCU. And so allow me to ask our speakers to greet you and say something before we can start to engage. Let's start with Mrs. Kawoya. Mrs. Kawoya, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Chitaimba. Praise the Lord. I am so glad to be here to share my simple thoughts about my ministry with children. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mama Petrina. Over to you, Dr. Senyonyi.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I was amused, actually, when you said that I started out as a teaching assistant at Makerere University, because in those days, they never called us that. They actually called us special assistants. or the other term that Professor Langland used, he called us academic houseboys. That's what we were, sustaining that university during those tough years. But anyway, good afternoon. It's good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you that we praise the Lord that you could raise from being an academic houseboy to a vice chancellor. We praise the Lord. And now, friends, I was reading and I was reading about education and it's the importance that people have placed on education. For example, when you listen to Nelson Mandela saying that education is the most powerful weapon which one could use to change the world. And you think about atheists like John Dewey saying that education is not preparation for life, education is life itself. Now, to you, Dr. John Senyonyi, let me start with you. Do you think that we can place, as Christians, we can place such an importance on education? Is education that important?
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. And it is important to the extent that, one, God gave us the intellect, gave us the ability to learn, gave us the ability to grow in knowledge. And this is a gift that God gave us. And so to do otherwise is, to me, unthinkable, if not totally irresponsible. So I would say, yes, education is very important. In fact, if I may add just one quote, this one now was from Mahatma Gandhi, who was asked, although I take it with a pinch of salt, but he was asked about the most important thing that India needed as it went into independence. And he said, education, education, education. I say that I take it with a pinch of salt because I personally would think that there is more to it than just saying education, education, education. So I would say, yes, it's very, very important.
Thank you so much. You have told us that it is just maybe before you can conclude. Let me ask the question I would have asked first, because it is out there and people asking themselves that is it important for example, for reverends, for Christian ministers to have an education, or is, for example, Christian ministry simply inspiration by the Holy Spirit?
Well, I think I would say that any minister who despises education is either suffering from an inferiority complex because they never had it, or they lack clarity about God's word and God's purpose. It's absolutely essential that ministers would be sharpened. But the second reason I would give is the fact that if the world is moving on in understanding, in technology and everything else, the knowledge has increased, as Daniel told us. I always pity any clergyman who is satisfied with mediocrity in terms of education, who stands before people that have PhDs, that have masters, that have degrees, and they are keeping themselves at the lowest. That is unacceptable. At least you should be a master in your own, the theological studies. But of course, for any minister, the encouragement that I always give is that no minister worth their salt should keep themselves narrowed merely to theology. The theologizing needs to broaden to other aspects so that a minister is informed politically, a minister is informed in economics and every area of life. So I would say every minister needs an education.
Thank you so much, Dr. Senyonyi. Thank you for those responses. And Petrina, now having talked about the ministers, do you think that as the people who are not ministers, the people on this call, most of them are not ministers, is it worthwhile for us to pursue education, to pursue training, to pursue professionalization, or we should keep ourselves away from the world, because we are in this world, but we are not of the world?
We indeed need to be educated because the world is moving and the world is changing. And if we do not change, then it will leave us behind. So, and then the children we are working with today are in a world that is changing and they are moving fast. So if we do not upgrade and upskill, we will not be able to speak the same language they will be in, and we will not be able to guide and help them because they will feel that they are higher than us. So we need to be educated ourselves, and we need to keep on upgrading and upskilling in order to keep up with the change.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Kaweya. And I think it was Plato who thought about the way the society is structured. And he said that, like an insect, in society we have the head, we have the thorax, and then we have the abdomen. And then he said, but you see, the most important part of all that is the head, because the head is the one which thinks on behalf of the entire thorax and abdomen. I think once they have thought the head, the thorax is the one that then supervises the abdomen in implementation. And so what you are saying is that if in the head where policies are made, if in the head where the highest decisions are made, if in the head in parliament where decisions on what to spend on and how to spend on, we don't have Christians in those rooms, we don't have Christians in the boardrooms, then we are in serious trouble. I think this is the message that I am getting from our speakers. And now you have also told us that the church, I think, should be interested in education. I'm not going to ask you whether the church should be interested. I think we all agree that the church should be interested. Now, Dr. John Senyonyi, there is some quote I read, and I'm going to read it verbatim so that you can help us then to understand this quote. It is by Abraham Lincoln. He says that the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of government in the next. I could paraphrase it and say that the philosophy of the schoolroom in one generation will be the philosophy of the head in the next. And so I wanted us to reflect on the Ugandan education system. What do you think is now the prevalent philosophy in the classroom? At Kampala Parents, at Nabinonya Primary School, what is the prevalent philosophy?
Well, I would say that very largely, and I think this is particularly government driven, it is more toward jobs, more toward remuneration, more toward skilling, now this is not because those are unimportant. I think they are very important. More, so the education is more, when it is pushed from government's production, it is jobs, it's welfare, being paid, becoming wealthy, and things of that nature. So that's what I seem to see, particularly from the side of government. I don't blame government. That is exactly their sphere, that they've got to make sure that people work and they're well. So their welfare is very important. It just concerns me if that flows into the Christians, particularly, that if that excludes God's mandate for us in terms of education, then I become very concerned. But that's what I seem to see. And I think when you go to Christians, generally speaking, I can probably call it a laissez-faire attitude, whereby Christians, you know, even those that have founded Christian schools, and I'm not saying all of them, so I'm generalizing here, but there is a tendency that to believe that once you have set the vehicle in motion, then it can run on a highway. I think that's the figure that I would give. very unfortunately, then we sit back and we are settled, and the world keeps on moving and bringing more challenges. But because we think that we have done what we expected to do, we retreat into our enclave, and we are trying to make sure that we remain Christian where we are. That is, if we are even doing the right thing. So there is a laissez-faire attitude, I think, among many Christians, even in Christian schools. And this is particularly evident with church schools, that there is that laissez-faire. As long as the bishop can visit and come and do confirmation, or there is a chaplain in the place, and many of them don't even have a chaplain, and so on. We think, okay, we set the vehicle in motion. It can now go on the expressway from Busega to Entebbe without any problem. Now, that is wrong, and we need to change our minds concerning that.
Wow, wow, wow. Thank you so much for helping us paint that picture. And you have left us at the very good stage to engage with Mrs. Kawoya. Having heard about that attitude, where it's about grades, where it is about setting something in motion and hoping that things will turn out different, Mrs. Kawoya, how can we possibly reclaim the Ugandan education system from that one that is purely focusing on jobs, grades, getting rich, to possibly that one which is value-based, to that one which is Christian, to that one which is seeking the greater good? How can we go about that as an educator, Mrs. Kawoya?
Thank you, Doctor. I think we need to think about to set objectives and goals, and they should be centered on Christ, because teaching is not just a job for a Christian, but it is a ministry. Mm-hmm. And when it is a ministry, you have to do it right, and you get instruction from the Lord. So you cannot afford to have a school and let it run, but you have to participate actively. And you have to base whatever you do on what Christ tells you. The curriculum, the content. It's not just only writing things and letting them go, but you have to participate and ensure that Christ is taught correctly and the way you want him to be presented. You have to participate in, ensure that in the planning, there is prayer, that you teach, like I teach kindergarten. And my goal is to ensure that the 3 years that a child is given to me, they must know who Jesus Christ is by the time they leave the kindergarten. I have to make most of every opportunity. So in the subjects that are taught, I have to see that Christ is brought in. Bible is not just reading the Bible, but the lesson has to be taught, and there must be a biblical application from whatever we teach in the class. We must teach children how to pray and also to be practical about what Christ says. So, and then we have to teach them also Christian values and also be able to live them, not just say them, but see that we, the people who at the schools are there, and that the teachers we employ and the other workers that are there also are able to inculcate these Christian values in the children we teach.
Wow, thank you so much, Mrs. Kawoya, for that very insightful experience. And I'm happy to note that for you, you walk the talk. Whatever it is that you are talking about, you do it, and we can testify about that. Thank you so much. Now to you, Dr. Senyonyi. There is something that is very surprising about this country. When you look at the statistics, you'll find that Africans and Ugandans in particular are very hospitable. They are known to be very hospitable. They are known to be very religious. And I think if you look at the national statistics, over 80% of Ugandans are Christian. They profess to be Christians, and they are so loving. But you might find that this is the country which has most strikes, most mob justice, corruption is rampant. The truth is at an all-time low, telling the truth. And you think about the school system, for example, most of the schools are owned by the church, either the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church. The hospitals, they're owned by the church. And so, given that we have so many Christian schools, what has gone wrong? Because it looks like we are not achieving what the Christian school is supposed to achieve. What is wrong with the Christian university or the Christian school?
Well, that is in part what I touched on, the laissez-faire attitude. For example, for the church, there is no intentionality, there is no effort that is put in it to ensure, in fact, what my sister Petrina has been talking about, to ensure that the Christian faith, which formed the foundational mission of the schools, is reflected. And this does not mean just reflected among the students, but like she was saying, it must be reflected, let me put it this way, holistically. You take, for example, the governance of the schools. Some of the bishops even withdrew from being chairs, and now the chairs who are there, you are not sure that they are doing the right thing. Many of the bishops do not, or many of the dioceses do not actually take enough care to ensure that the head teachers who are in our schools indeed subscribe to the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ. I'm not talking about, because there are too many secular Christians. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about someone who truly believes that this is a mission school. Let it be a mission school because the church is trying to bring an impact. So there is no attention. And by the way, these are things that we are able to do. There is no attention to what are the policies that we ourselves are using in these various schools, or what kind of life is being passed on in these schools. So I think there is a lot that we have a lot of problems as far as the education institutions are concerned. But may I also, at it, because you're asking a very, very big question here, may I also fall back a little bit and just say, there is also parents who have relinquished their responsibility toward their children. And think that the school is the one that is to do the miracle. Now, in my understanding and much of what I have read, it's very, very clear that if Christianity is to be inculcated in our children, the first 6 years, psychologists tell me, the first 6 years are the most formative. Once you lose those first 6 years, when you should be planting the values, planting the faith, and so on, because that's a kind of education. So as we talk about education, it's not only the institutional, we should also be thinking about this informal education that the child has before starting school, or even when out of school and at home. Those all become very important. So overall, I think just, I could say much, much more, but let me just put it this way, that we are not doing what the church required. You may remember that at UCU, we moved toward mentoring students. You see, the whole task of the mission of the church in schools should be a task that is directed toward mentoring, toward formation. It's not just the head, and even if we are talking about faith, we are not just interested in people who know the Bible, who can pray. We are talking about people who must think Christianly, who must walk Christianly, who must live Christianly. And these are the kinds of things that should be reflected right from home into the schools. The church has a mission, and that mission, unfortunately, is not being carried out in the right way. And that's why I said that there's a laissez-faire attitude concerning the education system in our particular schools. So maybe let me stop here because I could say a lot more, but let me stop there for the time being.
I am going to come back to you, but first to Mrs. Kawoya.
Yes.
Dr. Senyonyi has hinted on it, but you can help us because you work with people that have children between the ages of 0 to 6, between the ages of 4 to 14. What do you think is the role of the parents in passing on a Christian education? Does it only end with only selecting a Christian school and sending the child there and hoping that things will work out well?
The parent has a very major role here because they are the first caregiver. The child is born in the home and he begins to breathe and grow in the home. And whatever the child's education begins there. Whatever the child sees is what the child will take up. Parents have given us the responsibility to care for their children, but unfortunately, as Dr. Senyoni said, in some schools, the people do not mind about the Christian faith. So a child needs to begin at home to learn to pray, to be read to sing, because that is where all cognitive development begins at that age, and 85% of the brain development is and character is there by the age of 5. So so many skills need to begin to be taught at home, even speech and language. Children come to school when they know their different languages, and that is where they pick others. So they do not only pick the language, but they also speak the tone and the words. So if it is foul language, that is what they will begin with and grow with. And unless it is checked, which unfortunately is not done in some schools, the children will continue with that. And then also they begin to learn also the fine motor skills and also relating with others. And so a lot of what they pick up at home will continue on in a school unless it is checked by Christian principals and teachers who are intentional. If they are not, it will just continue. We get all the abuse, we get all the manners, we get everything that they watch on TV. It all comes to school. And then if we are Christians and we are intentional, then we start working at it. But if you're not, it will just grow and continue. So the parents have the major responsibility of caring for children and introducing Christ to them at home when the children are still young and even as they grow.
Wow, thank you so much. I know I am fathering a 2-year-old now. I think Dr. Senyoni and Mrs. Petrina forgot about those ones. But about 4 months ago, I went back home and she was jeering. And then I had to find out who of the people at home was jeering, because she was learning how to jeer and she was enjoying it, and she didn't know what it meant. But one of the things that happened about 2 weeks ago, she learned how to pronounce the name of Mr. Mgawe. And now when she wakes up, she talks about Mr. Mgawe. And so about 4 days ago, they were telling her that Mr. Mgawe, your friend. And then she said, no, Mr. Mgawe, daddy's friend. And this is a 2-year-old who has decided that Mr. Mgawe is my friend and not her friend. And so whatever it is that you are doing to a 2-year-old, you might think that they don't understand, but they really do understand. And so it matters. Dr. Senyonyi, according to Deuteronomy 6, verses 6 and 7, would they tell us that these commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts? Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them up as symbols on your hands, and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. And the question that comes to my mind when I read this is what do you think as Christians we can learn about that biblical education system that is described in Deuteronomy 6?
I think I want to say at least 4 things. The very first one, and I wish, I mean, when you read 6 to 7, you leave out quite a bit that follows there, and people need to be able to read all of that, verse 9 up to verse 9, and probably even beyond, even in the context of the 5 books of Moses. And the very first lesson that I want to bring out, and I think extremely, extremely vital, that the most vital education begins with the father. That commandment was not actually being given to mothers. This is not to say that mothers are not concerned about it, but this is to say that unfortunately, for us fathers, we tend to think that the mother takes care of those emotional things that you do with the child. We may consider it emotional or whatever. And we forget that the first commandment is given to us as fathers. That's the first lesson. And I think it's an important lesson that for anybody who is a father should be able to take it up and realize it's absolutely essential. Secondly, what comes through there is that the home environment must be consistent with what we teach or what we instruct. In other words, we contradict ourselves if we say one thing and we do a different thing. We talk about prayer, but we are not seen by our children praying, because that's part of it. We talk about reading the Bible, but the children can never see us reading the Bible. So the home environment must be consistent with what we teach, because we need to understand that the Christian worldview is passed on both by instruction and by our life. So that is the second lesson. The third, an education without the fear of God, as it has been said, and many people attribute this saying to C.S. Lewis, only prepares a clever devil. Okay? Actually, there is dispute whether it was C.S. Lewis who said it. I don't know anywhere where he said it. But the point is that when you teach, when you give an education, minus the transcendent, the sovereign voice of truth, voice of good, voice of what is right and what is wrong, then you're simply training that child to become a clever devil. But the fourth lesson, if I may, is that Christian education must be, I don't know what word to use, whether intergenerational or cross-generational. In other words, God expects that your Christian faith is passed on to your children. That's why he tells them to instruct. And as much as he tells the fathers to instruct, it means that even the children who have learned, when they come into the same position, shall pass on the same. Now, sadly, I think we find Muslims and Hindus and so on, they seem to do a much better job with that than we do as Christians. But it is supposed to be, is the right word intergenerational or cross-generational? But you understand what I mean, from one generation to another generation. I think those 4 lessons we must have very, very clearly in our hearts as we do our informal training. Now, once again, let me just say, I said fathers, But this is not to say that mothers should be less concerned. It was only said in the context of the leadership of the father. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, and in the Great Commission, Jesus Christ says, and teaching them to obey. The intergenerational aspect that you bring in, that the people who have been taught, they have got to pass on what they have learned to the next generation. And it is that song that we sing, ancient words of our faith. Those ancient words that have been handed down, not very easily, but through sacrifice. That is our Christian faith, and that's what we can learn. And Mrs. Kawoya, I just wanted now to tap into your experience as a school owner, as a leader of the school, and as a leader of, for example, the peak schools. How have you been able to juggle the sacred with the secular? For example, if you run an advert and two teachers seek employment at your school, and you find that one is slightly less qualified than the other, but the other one is far better versed in the Christian tradition, who gets the job at peak schools?
Doctor, concerning Christian education, there is no juggling. One has to be deliberate, intentional, and one has to know exactly what you want. The things of God are orderly, and they are clearly stated in the Word of God. So even as we look for teachers to help us teach these children, we have to pray for God's guidance and follow his instruction, because that school is his and the children are his. So what to me, if I just pick what I think without asking the Lord to guide me? So we have a clear Christian-based policy, and we follow that. So if a person's values are different, and if as we interview, we ask them, we choose the one who the Lord would choose. We prioritize on who God would have. So okay, it is so easy for them to tell us lies, but then sometimes these easy questions like, where do you pray from? Who preached on Sunday? You get them. Somehow the Lord will give you the wisdom to get people. And even when they come in, when they are not Christian, after a short time you discover. And so we have to, we put in position ways to let them go if they are not Christian. So yes, we have to be intentional, because we know that woe to us if we mislead the children of God. He has given us a responsibility, and we have to ensure that we carry it on well.
Wow, thank you so much. So to you, there is no compromise. There is no compromise.
Can I just add something there?
Yes.
Because I think what she has said is very important. And I just want to, because this is a struggle that we had even at Uganda Christian University.
And as you add, I just wanted to just complicate it a little bit further.
Oh,
as you add, there is also this other tendency on the other side, where because it is Uganda Christian University and I'm a reverend, even if I'm mediocre, I expect to be employed by Uganda Christian University. How did you handle that? Please go ahead and show us.
Well, first and foremost, let me just say, what I was going to say was that it's interesting in my experience, and of course, with a big number of staff members, when there are fewer, it's a little easier, but with a big number, every job seeker who entered the gates of Uganda Christian University coming for an interview became a Christian at the gate. I mean, of course, some, thankfully, were believers. And I think she intimated on it that you really have to seek God's mind. Is this the right person? And be given the wisdom to interview in such a way that the person is teased out. A couple of examples would be very interesting and actually relates to what you are just asking. One was a time quite early. I was then still the Deputy Vice Chancellor, and we had a problem. We needed to hire someone who was an ICT expert to head ICT. Now you may say, oh, well, that's just a technical thing. It's not going to have influence on people. Well, this particular gentleman told us he was an Anglican. He had just returned from abroad. He had married a Muslim wife. And so on, of course, in the teasing out. And we said no. And I remember at that time, it was no small argument. And we were desperate. You know, as a university, we were extremely desperate to get someone. But we stood our ground and we said, no, we are not taking this person. Anglican as he is, he's married to a Muslim. No. Why? Because a teacher or a lecturer is a role model. Is a role model. And you cannot separate that role modeling from the rest of the work that the teacher does. The second example was an agnostic, highly commended, had his PhDs and all that. And I'm afraid that also wouldn't fly for us. Now, how did we sieve them out? Partly in the interview, because we went through quite a few interview processes. And indeed, I totally agree with Petrina. It has got to be done prayerfully. But at the same time, especially for the senior staff, if you are coming to teach at UCU, you had to have an interview with me as Vice Chancellor. It does not matter. You may think, oh, how can you interview 150 people? Yes, at the time of entry, you had to interview with me, and I had to be satisfied. And I turned off quite a few people. And once as Vice Chancellor, I said no. You know, of course, because I didn't sit in the search committee meetings. But the moment I would say no, that person would not be hired. Now, the other thing that we did, and I had a form that they would fill in, and then I would start teasing them out. And it's a form that I had crafted, and we were using it. The other thing, of course, was a requirement to sign certain faith statements, faith commitments. There is at Uganda Christian University what is called the Instruments of Identity, which specify very clearly what we believe, how we live, and our worship. And that was necessary for each and every staff member. I'm glad that toward the end of my vice chancellorship, the University Council said all staff members should sign this, all of them. And even the council members were signing it. All the board members were signing it. Everybody had to sign it. And it had to be signed annually, not just once. So there were a number of intentional activities. I must say, it has to be very intentional. Not only just for the recruitment, but also what are the expectations? What are the policies saying? That person must be able to sign and say, this is what I'm committing myself to. So that if they fail, yes, I am out of here. But just one last thing so that I don't take too long that I need to say here, that one of the biggest challenges, of course, that we face, particularly in higher education, I suppose even in primary and kindergarten and so on, there aren't enough believers who are true disciples. I'm not talking about just, I gave my life to Christ. You know, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about someone who is walking, because what Jesus sent the church to do was to make disciples, not to make converts. Okay? So there are not enough disciples who are there. They believe, they live, they, you know, everything about them, who are also willing to go into the education system. And my challenge to all who are listening, please, if you are in education, remember you have a responsibility as a mission toward the Christian schools. Thank you. God bless you.
Man, thank you so much. And maybe what I wanted you to talk about, but let me talk about it. that we have talked about the other side. But it is also not okay for you to just be a born-again Christian who prays, speaks in tongues, but who is unschooled and uneducated in the things of the world. I think if you look at the story of Daniel, Daniel was really a prayerful man, committed to God, but he was also excellent at what he did. And so even as born-again Christians, even as Christians, there is value in us attaining the highest level of education. Because if you came to UCU, now my experience that I have as DVC, when I'm putting on a collar, sometimes when people come in my office and they find me putting on a collar, the first thing they think is that I don't know anything. I'm just in the office because I have a collar, which is a very strange thing. It is only when we start talking that they realize that maybe I know something, but then they become serious. So I think even as Christians, we need to become excellent at what we are supposed to be doing. If you are in IT and you are a Christian, please be a committed Christian, but also be excellent at the IT. In mathematics, we have two words. We have what we call necessary, and then we have what we call sufficient. And so in mathematics is what we say necessary and sufficient. Now, to be a Christian, it is necessary, it is a necessity. At UC, you have to be a Christian, but it is not sufficient. It is necessary, but not sufficient. Excellence in the art in which you are involved is also required. And Dr. Senyonyi, I know our time is up. I'm going to ask you one question, and I'll ask Aunt Petrina one. But if I don't ask you this question, people will be very unhappy with me. When you are a DVC here and when you are a VC at UCU, UCU was in the news for having policies such as the dress code, policies on those people who are not married and whatever. And so the question that people wanted me to ask you today as you are here and as you are talking about education is that do you think it is important to do that? And you have already answered there, but just that, would you employ someone that is cohabiting? And how much influence do you think a Christian learning environment has on the workers themselves, not on the students, but on the workers themselves?
Okay, let me begin first of all, and I'm sorry, I know time is gone, but let me begin first of all by saying what you said was so good, and let me just make this sweeping statement that if Christians shun higher education, the world will think for them. It's just that simple. The world will think for them. Is that what we want? I don't think so. Okay, so now coming back to your question, because time is against us, I should say, if the purpose of education is holistic, because that's what God actually sends us out to do. When we talk of a disciple, we're not talking about someone who speaks Christianity or Christianese, as I sometimes call it. We are talking about a totality of what we are. And so if the purpose is holistic education, then it becomes absolutely important for us to understand that there is no aspect of a person's life that is outside the Christianity. So it comes down then to dress code, how the person dresses, that the way we dress, communicate, even the world knows, by the way, even the world knows. They see the way you're dressing, and if they hear you now talking about Jesus, they start wondering, is this really true? They want to listen a little bit more, but somehow they see a contradiction between how you dress and what you say. So when it comes to a Christian institution, we must be intentional about being holistic, about dress code, about behavior. And like I said, the instruments of identity at UCU are very useful because that part about our conduct, how we shall live, is, I think, a very, very important part in the instruments of identity, which stipulates a lot of things that many people don't think about. What shall we do? What about drinking? You know, alcohol at the university. And we said, no, it's not acceptable. What about sexual immorality? And that covers whether it's cohabitation or something else. All these have got to be left out. Why? Because our desire is not simply to inform, but to form the student, so that that student now is going to be a student who knows, but who also lives the Christian faith. Thank you.
Wow, wow, thank you so much. Thinking about the dress code and UCU, the other graduation, not the last one, but the previous one, we insist on the dress code here. And there was something very embarrassing because there is a vehicle which had a parent and the graduate, and the parent was refused to enter the university because the parent was not putting on according to the dress code as being, which is very embarrassing. So yes, this happens, and we have to do it. And Petrina Kaoya. Now, finally, as I come to you, we have talked Christian and we have gone to several aspects, but I want you now, as you conclude and as you make your concluding remarks, do you think there is anything that parents miss out when they send their children to a secular school and they don't send them to peak schools? Or do you think it is okay, they can still do the formation at home? And what do you think?
When you don't send your child to a Christian school, you are allowing them to spend many hours with the people who are non-Christian. And some of these people, by the way, they are very intentional. Just as we are intentional in Christian schools, some other people are very intentional. They say, this is what you must do here. So I think that if a child is in a Christian school which is not just Christian, but where the teachers are truly born again, they help to influence and form the Christian principles and values in that child, and it will help that child to keep on in the same system at home and at school. But Jesus Christ is very amazing in that sometimes children are not in Christian schools and they're Christians. They actually meet Christ alone and they keep going. But I think it will be of a great advantage, especially from the formative years when the children pick up a lot and continue in school and in colleges which are Christian. It will help them to be grounded, although some still move out when they grow up.
Wow, thank you so much, Aunt Petrina and Dr. Senyonyi. In a few words, the Christian revival movement, some of these movements, when they came, they over spiritualized the things in the world and they gave up education. And Christians have not been very mindful of education. And I was reading a quote, I think it was from Australia, and let me just read the quote verbatim. And it says that the survival, this was a quote in 1968 by Christopher Jenks and David Reisman. It says, the survival of reasonably Protestant colleges therefore seems to depend on the survival within the larger society of Protestant enclaves, whose members believe passionately in a way of life radically different from that of the majority, and who are both willing and able to pay for a brand of higher education and education that embodies their vision. Such enclaves still exist, but they are few in number. Now, my question to you is that what can we do? Because this is very true. I was talking to a reverend from Australia this morning, and he said that the church had given up on education, but in the last few years now they have started establishing Protestant Christian schools in Australia. What is it that we can do in Uganda that we can get back the heart of education? Thank you so much.
First and foremost, talking about the revival, I think the problem was not that they despised education. They didn't. In fact, the two major areas which they also mistakenly avoided were business and politics. That was a mistake to avoid them. In the case of education, the problem was their failure to take up positions of authority, because positions of authority are positions of influence, right? So they totally failed to do that. And to the extent that they failed to take up positions of influence, then education was flowing with the nominal church leaders, okay? So the nominal church leaders, until eventually when the Balokole got into positions of authority, today I think we would say that our bishops, all of them will say that they are saved. I do not want to start doubting that. But until later, when they started taking positions of influence, very unfortunately, by then, the ball had rolled very, very far. Even the nationalization of schools, the surrender of the schools, and things like that. And that was essentially because of failure to take up positions of influence. Take, for example, in the Ministry of Education. Were they there? I don't think so. You know, the revival people just were not there. They were educated, but they were not in those positions. And so very sadly, they spent a lot of time preaching the gospel, which was right, but they forgot that as you preach the gospel, you also need to take these positions of influence, and I think it's an important thing. So when it comes back then to today, because I think that's where you're leading me, when it comes back to today, I do believe that the church still, as long as it still has the mandate given to it, by the way, by government itself as a founder body, as long as it has that, it now falls on the church and on us. When I say church, I'm talking about us as well, to rise up and ensure that there is a process of reclamation of our schools. I do remember in Mukono Diocese, Bishop Senyimba some years ago, I'm not now very conversant what's happening, but some years ago he started reclaiming them. And I think even Bishop Sebagala reclaimed the primary school, you know, and all that. Now, these are very important steps. We may not have enough teachers that we know are as convictional as we are about our faith, but as long as you reclaim them and you decide how those schools are going to be run, it does make a difference. And this is, I think, where the failure has been, particularly with the church. And as long as we are members of the church, we too have a responsibility. Yes, we may establish some schools. And by the way, Professor Chitaimbwa, you may not know, but I was involved in founding a school, and I was involved in it for over 20 years. I was actually involved in that school up to the level of being vice chair of the board for most of those years, actually. So I've been involved in that school. That particular one was not Christian per se, because of the people that we were working with. But the point is, we cannot run away from our responsibility as Christians within the church, or even without the church, like Petrina, with the school that they have, ensuring that we know what needs to be done so that faith flows throughout everything in our schools.
Wow, and wow, friends, join me in appreciating the words of wisdom that we have received. One takeaway for us is that Christians don't shun education, Christians don't shun influence, Christians don't shun politics, Christians don't shun business. Let us go into all the world, into all those areas, and make disciples for Christ. Praise the name of the Lord. Now, over to the Reverend God, who is going to lead us through announcements very quickly.